remember this reading about this book so many times before I ever read the book. It's because it's referenced everywhere. It seems like all the great writers, all the great spiritual thinkers have an encounter with this book where they footnote it, they include it in their references.
A month does not go by at this house where I do not read it again. I discovered this book on my dad's shelf, and my father was a poet as well. Later on, he wrote books. He was also a music publisher. He was also a traveling speaker, but he always thought of himself as a poet. That somewhere along the line, the title "Letters to a Young Poet" caught his eye, and so he brought it home. And he and I never talked about it. I don't know if he ever read it or if he read it, but I don't know. But I read it because at that time, early in my life, I was writing bad high school poetry. I suspect thinking that I was going to become a poet. I would take, when I was 15, I fell in love with a girl just down the aisle in algebra class. Her name was Susie. And I would take Paul Simon lyrics and redo them so that they were about her and me. And I would lie on my back in the hallway and read these lyrics to her. And she thought I wrote them because she didn't listen to Paul Simon. She only listened to Motown. Okay. It worked like a charm. It was great. Later on, I read Letters to a Young Poet more seriously and realized that, interestingly enough, and Rilke was a strange man in all kinds of ways, um, in all kinds of ways, without any question. Um, but realized that it was speaking to me spiritually as well as speaking to me about being a poet and a writer, and speaking to me in deep ways, very upfront, straight ahead ways about what it means to be a person who lives out of their spirit and has their spirit fed by what's going on in the world around them. He was it was terribly interesting. I never met him, of course. He died long before I came around. He was uh, he was the secretary to the famous sculptor Rodin for some years in Paris. And once, not too long ago, when I was in Paris, I went to Rodin's house, this beautiful, enormous place. And I got to be in the room where Rilke lived and worked, and felt again this kind of core connection with him. I also spent 2 years um, teaching a creative arts class at the high school where my daughter and son went. And we used Letters to a Young Poet as the core text. And so I taught it twice a week for 2 years. Um, Summers off, of course. But um, and so found myself more deeply engaged with the text and what it meant.
So what made him strange?
Oh, he was a writer. He was married a couple of times. He became a monk for a while in Russia. He worked for Rodin. He gave up his citizenship in Czechoslovakia or some place like that, and then became a citizen of two other countries. Um, he was basically penniless his entire life, um, and wandered around from place to place and talked people into letting him live in their house. And He was just he was this odd artist. Um, he just was. He was fascinating, but he was a strange man. And frankly, I didn't know much about him when I first read the book. Even when I taught it later, read it later, taught it later, I didn't know these things about him. And um, so all of these things are relatively new to me, but it is fascinating to me that just from that one work, um, he passed along this strange, odd living person, um, passed along to me some of the most important truths that I've ever known in my life.
I cannot wait to read this book with you again. Um, what about this particular translation, this edition?
So that was the first one that I ever saw, the Stephen Mitchell translation.
Yeah.
And then from time to time, other people would come out with other translations, and they simply were not as good to me. And so that's my favorite one. The ones that follow behind try to explain too much, and it's it's a waste of time. Don't explain him.
All right. Well, looking forward to chatting with you and listening to you share about your experience with this book, with these letters, and then certainly excited about the conversation that will follow.
Okay.
Thanks, Robert.